G'day everyone, Dikko here with another kick-ass walkthrough. This is the final video of this series for character rigging. So it's a long time coming, I know, but we're going to talk about weight painting. And weight painting is a total bitch to do if you don't understand exactly what's going on. And even when you do exactly know what's going on, it's still a pain in the ass. So that's part of the reason why I haven't really covered it in a while since the previous video. Is apart from life getting in the way, it's also a fairly complex subject to cover if you're doing a whole character at once. And if you've never done it before, it's really hard to understand what the hell's going on if I were to just go step by step using the whole character. So what I'm going to do here, this video is going to be more of an overview of what you can try to use when you're doing weight painting, because with all things, especially with this sort of stuff, there's like 5 or 6 different methods you can go with. And as you may know, you may be using your own character, you may be using the one that I provided, but these different methods suit different scenarios, and there is no one-stop shop, no one-size-fits-all method for doing weight painting. So I thought, let's break it down to the most basics. I'm going to start with a very simple piece of geometry here, an arm with some fingers. And then we're going to do different methods with this basic setup here that you may be able to apply to your overall model. I think that's a better method to go with rather than doing the whole damn thing at once. So hopefully what you get from this video, even though it's not going to be the whole character, it will be enough information for you to actually translate that to your own characters in the most efficient way possible. So without further ado, let's get started. So we have an arm here. It's a pretty straightforward model, not much going on, but there's enough geometry for us to test out the most basic stuff first. So I also have a very basic rig here, no new controls, nothing like that, just straight up deform bones, nothing's fancy. But we're going to start off with automatic weights. So automatic weights is really damn reliable in Blender. The only caveat is that if you have multiple objects that you need to automatically weight, it does start to break down a little bit. But if you have a straight up piece of geometry with nothing else on it, so like a naked person or like a single mesh, then automatic weights is really reliable inside of Blender. And if you can get away with this, this is the only thing you'll need to do. Just straight up click on the mesh, click on the rig, and then Control P, automatic weights. Now, you'll see that for the most part, it works pretty damn well. So if we were to automatically weight that, you can see the arms working really well. Blender's, yeah, like I said, it's probably one of the best out there in my opinion, in terms of like getting things done quickly and not having to worry too much about like having to fix up deformations. But if you have a more complicated piece of geometry than this, then we'll have to start talking about how to do a better job of this. But if you're happy with this level of deformation, then you can just stop the video right now, you're good to go. But things start to get a bit more complicated if you have a few things going on. So let's start off with geometry in terms of density. First off, before we get started with that, I just want to point out that when you do automatic weights, you want to make sure that at least when you are doing rigging, you are putting your armature at the top of your modifier stack. You only want the armature to manipulate the base mesh. You don't want to be doing extra calculations on top of it. If you have it underneath the subdivision, for instance, you're potentially doubling or quadrupling the computation power or requirement needed to deform your mesh, and it's a lot harder to actually weight paint that. So what you're better off is actually putting that armature at the top of your stack first and foremost. Now, let's talk about what just happened when we have done automatic weights. So if we click on the mesh and go to the little object data properties, you'll see that we have these vertex groups created. And these vertex groups are related directly to the bones of your rig. And you can tell as such because they're labeled exactly as they are inside of your armature. All right. So you can see here, for instance, we have bicep and forearm and thumb and all sort of shit. And if we go to the vertex groups, they are all visible inside here. And vertex groups are basically just containers for, well, weight data. And they can be used for all kinds of shit in Blender. They're actually quite flexible. They're very powerful things. But in the case of rigging, they're used for telling Blender or telling the software that this mesh has a connection to the joints of this rig. Now, each of these vertex groups have basically set according to the individual vertices of your mesh. And each vertice has at least 1 or 2 or 3 different values according to whatever it's connected to. So, you know, for instance, up here at the end of my arm, let me just turn off the subdivision here. You'll see that the vertex weights over here have assigned this vertex with a value of 1 on the bicep joint or the bicep vertex group. But if we move closer towards the elbow, for instance, a vertex over here has a more interesting distribution. This vertex has been weighted to get influence from, or deformation influences from, or information from both the forearm and the bicep joint, and they each have an intrinsic value. So the forearm is controlling this vertex more than the bicep by a factor of 2, almost, just over 2. So for instance, the forearm is going to manipulate this particular vertex. I guess around 70% of that deformation will come from the forearm, and around 30% will come from the bicep. You'll also notice that by default, each of these values will equal a total of 1. And that's really important as we get into this information in the future. So as we start to manually manipulate our vertex weights or our weight paints, keep that in mind that each of these vertices need to have a vertex weight total of around 1. It's not perfect all the time when you do it automatically. Obviously, you can see here that even though it's a forearm, it's got 99%, but don't worry about that. The only minimum thing you need to understand is that each vertex needs to have at least some sort of influence from any given joint. You can see here, you can have quite a few on a particular part of the body as well. So for instance, this vertex here has 4 influences coming from different joints. So one's coming from the forearm itself, some from the wrist, 70% is coming from the wrist, 2% is coming from the pinky joint down here, and then we've got a few others from the middle joint as well. So yeah, you can have multiple influences on a single vertex, and that helps to, you know, when you put it all together, it allows you to manipulate the entire model. All right, just keep that in mind. So let's talk about how you can actually weight paint in general. How do you manually do this? So if you in case you get some issues where you want to do this manually, where you have a unique model which has, you know, fairly specific requirements, how do you go about manually creating your weights for any given model? So I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to duplicate this once more, like so. Let's apply those locations. I'm going to remove this armature, and first thing I'm going to do is just remove those vertex groups. So as we talked about a moment ago, each of these vertices already have some values. Even though the armature has been deleted, it actually retains the vertex groups. So what I'm going to do is remove these vertex groups, and I want to talk about how you can go about manually painting these weights, at least with a model like this. All right, so let's just delete all these groups, and I'm going to rebind to this rig here, Control P, but in this case, I'm going to say with empty groups. All right, click this button, and you'll see it adds the armature. But if I try to manipulate that armature right now, nothing happens. All right, nothing's happening because although it's added the vertex groups in or onto that geometry. It's added those groups. It hasn't assigned any value to the vertices in particular. So you can see here, there's no properties here, unlike this one, which has vertex weights. This one has no vertex weights assigned to any of these vertices. We've created the groups, but these groups are useless until we give it some sort of value to attach it to. So how do we go about weight painting manually? That's pretty straightforward. We just have to pop into the weight painting mode. So let's select the arm, select the rig first, then the arm, then jump over to the vertex paint mode. Sorry, weight paint mode. All right, now there's a few settings I would prefer you guys to turn on at first. And that would be to go over to the tool settings, go down to options and turn on auto normalize for now. That way, as you paint, every vertex will total that paint to a value of 1. If you don't do that, you can actually get values over the value of 1, and it can be a bit tricky to fix. So I would say turn on auto normalize and you'll be sweet. So by default, I would say bring your weight up to 1, your strength up to 1, and all you need to do is select any joint that you want to weight paint, and then you just gotta start painting in those values. And you'll see, because I have a strength of 1 turned on, as I brush over the vertex directly, it starts to add that value. And a value of 1 is represented by the color red in Blender. As you go down in value, it radiates down to about to the light blue color until it goes completely dark blue, equaling or representing the fact that there's no vertex weights assigned to that area. And you can see here that even though there's only 2 vertices between these 2 points here, it's still giving you a representation of that gradient. That's actually quite neat in the sense that it will actually tell you that if you were to subdivide this, that gradation will actually be inherited by that subdivision as well, which is useful. Anyway, normally you just go through and start to paint in the weights of that area that you want to be influenced by a particular joint, and go through and slowly just paint in those details. All right, you'll see here that it gets a bit tricky around the arm because we're getting to a point where we need to gradiate between these 2 joints here. So what I would do is, just for now, I'm just going to paint directly across to a value of 1 up until I get to the very center of that arm. And then for now, I'm going to skip that middle part and go to my forearm, control click that forearm, and do the same thing along the forearm, like so. And start painting in a value of 1 over here. Now this can get pretty tiresome, as you start to see, because the more density your mesh, the more painting you have to do and the more careful you have to be. And that gets really fucking annoying over time. All right, so just painting through, and the forearm's pretty simple in this case because there's only 2 joints, but then we start to get to stuff like the fingers and the hands, and then it gets really, really tiresome. So you can see here, for instance, the wrist. Started painting that wrist, gets a bit tiresome. So this is where automatic weights would come in handy to put that together. But for now, let's just quickly go ahead, and I'm just going to just brush in a pretty dirty manipulation here, and start to just paint in exactly where that wrist would be for now. Don't worry about don't worry about the fact that there are other joints that I need to manipulate. I will be adding that in a second, but just as a general rough pass, that's sort of where that palm joint is. So therefore, I'm just going to paint that in. Moving down into the thumb, I'm just going to replace those weights around that thumb area. And this is where you'd have to be pretty careful, kind of choosing those areas that you want to paint in. Until you get exactly what you need. Now, I'm just going to time-lapse this process because I don't want to be wasting your time watching me paint in all these different weights, and then we'll see what that effect looks like. All right, so I've really roughly done that. And you'll see now that if we go into the mesh and we look at our information here, you can see that my vertex weights are now all assigned for the most part. You'll see that the forearm, some vertex have the forearm assigned, others have the fingers assigned, wrist and middle. You'll see that there. You see the thumb here has some extra parts there. But you can see it's a lot more absolute. It's either 1 or 0 when it comes to the painting. Now, it's not going to be perfect. I can guarantee that because I haven't done it exactly. And there's a reason why. It's because I want to work in absolutes for now to sort of block out that weight paint. Now, if I try to manipulate that now, you'll see, and just so you know, let's have a look at some of these weights just to make sure that what I'm going to show you is true. You'll see that some of these vertex or vertices don't have weight paints or weight values assigned to them yet. I've done that intentionally because what I want to show you is if you don't have weights assigned to a vertice, it will still not be manipulated by the rig. So if I click on this bone, you can see here that I've got a value of 1 all the way up until that one line, that one span there where I haven't added any weights at all. Same with that one, and this span in the middle has practically 0 weights assigned to it. There's a reason why, is because what I'm going to do is smooth out these weights using Blender's smoothing tools. But if I try to manipulate that now, we're going to get something like this, where parts of the rig that don't have any values on them just stay put, and it just looks like an absolute nightmare, like so. Now, there is 2 ways you can go about fixing this. So if you have 2 joints and you want to blend them together to have influence influence that particular part of the geometry at different times, depending on what's being manipulated, you could go in and, for instance, you can go into the mesh, turn on weight paint, and then this is when you would change the weight value on your brush to maybe 0.5. And at this point, you would click on the bone that you want to give half a percentage on your weights and paint that in. Now you will see here that this is the one thing that sucks about Blender's representation of value, is that even though I'm painting 50% or 0.5, it still comes up as red. And that's partly because it's normalizing those strokes. It's normalizing those values. It will only turn green, i.e. 50%, once I paint the other half of that value from the other joint. So if I paint that in, now it looks a nice and clean 50% value, right? So that's one thing to be aware of when you're doing your manual weights. All right, cool. So let's paint that in. And you'll see that if I manipulate that arm, it's now following through with those joints. It's now following through. There's no more stretching or weird artifacts happening from those joints. But take a look here. You'll see that the value here between these 2 joints, this span is being manipulated exactly 50% between the 2 joints. So depending on how much accuracy you need in that, that's how you would go about manually smoothing out those groups. But what about all these other parts that, are so finicky to work with? Well, in this case, I would click on the rig, click on the mesh that I want to use, go to weight paint again. But in this case, I'm going to go to my weights and click on smooth. Now, you'll see that just by clicking on smooth straight away, it starts to smooth out those weights on whatever bone you have selected. But we can actually change that to, instead of active group, we can change that to all deformed pose bones. Click on that, and you'll see that if we were to select all of our joints, you'll see that it's starting to smooth out those groups across the board. All right, so if we start to do that again, let's do that again. Let's go to smooth. And we can actually increase the iteration so it starts to blend around the knuckles as well. And we can choose how much we want to smooth that in. So you can see here, this gradation is starting to get more and more softer, which means that the bone that precedes it is starting to influence these parts of the joints just as much. So this can be both a good thing and a bad thing, depending on how much influence you want these different areas to have from each other. So this is more of a trial and error game. So it's really dependent on how you go about doing this. So let's have a look and see what the end result is. So these have been smoothed out now. So it's automatically filled in the gaps for us. Let's see how it looks. Oh, not too bad. Not too bad at all. You can see we've got a few artifacts here and there, but overall, it's coming up pretty good. So you can see here, we're no longer getting those weird artifacts in those joints. And even if we try to manipulate that, we're getting a pretty good deformation out of here, out of the whole lot. And the nice thing is that it's nice and smooth. And if you wanted to have that level of control over how different parts of the geometry influence each other, this is how you go about that. This is how you go about manually manipulating those weights to get exactly what you want. Now, as I said, though, we run into issues when, for instance, you have a mesh that is ultimately a lot more dense than this. You can still go ahead and like fill in all those areas, block them out with a weight of 1, but smoothing it can be a lot more difficult. And this is where, in my opinion, using something like a cage mesh comes in handy. So this is really useful if you plan on having much more, having the weight paint much more denser geometry such as this. So let's talk about what a cage can do for you that makes life easier. All right, so what exactly is a cage? Well, a cage in this case is basically an ultra low poly version of your mesh that can encompass, well, everything that it surrounds. And then what we will do is weight paint this very basic mesh, and we would transfer the weights from the basic mesh to the more high density mesh. So how do we go about doing that? Well, and also, what are the advantages of doing it this way as well? So firstly, the advantage is that when you go to weight paint this, you're weight painting way less geometry than the high poly mesh. That's one big thing here. That's a very big advantage here. And I can actually reduce that a bit further still. That's a really big advantage in this case. What are the other advantages? Well, it reduces the amount of time it takes you to paint such a simple piece of geometry. So unlike the high density mesh, which you're having to paint all these different vertices, you're only going to have to paint, well, basically almost a quarter, maybe even less of the vertices for this particular mesh. The other thing is that it gives you a lot more control. It gives you way more control over how you distribute the weight transition from one joint to another. And I'll talk about how that works in a moment. But first, let's go ahead and do the same thing we've done with this medium density mesh and start to weight paint this low poly mesh. Again, I'm going to fast forward through this so it doesn't take up too much time. So again, selecting the low poly mesh I have here for my cage, select the rig that I have here, and then I'm going to parent with empty groups, and then we're going to start weight painting that. All right, so I don't know if you noticed that in terms of the time lapse, but it was definitely a lot faster to even just do the weight paints for this object here. So you can see here, we're getting quite a lot of pretty good deformation. We can see here where the hands are moving as needed. And the fingers are working as planned. So by having a lower poly mesh, let me just delete that. By having a lower poly mesh to weight paint to, you'll find that we get a much quicker weight paint result. And even if you had a lower poly mesh for just doing automatic weights, this can be really useful for getting quick and reliable results out of your mesh to transfer to a high poly mesh anyway. All right, so having a low poly mesh really does help in terms of just weight paint quality, or just getting a quality deformation faster, be the better way of putting it. All right, so if you have a high density mesh now that you want to transfer these weights to, we can use a modifier called data transfer. All right. So let's just get out of isolation mode there. You can see here that I've removed the weights from this particular rig. So although the low poly mesh is moving along with it, the high poly mesh hasn't got anything weighted to it. There's no armature attached to it at the moment. So what we can do is I'm just going to create a armature modifier on the high poly mesh. I'm going to link it to the rig that we need it for, like so. And obviously, because we have no vertex weights here, you'll see that it's not going to be manipulated, even if the modifier is present. It's not going to be transferring across, right? So what we can do is take the weights from this low poly mesh and transfer it to the high poly mesh based on the proximity of the vertices, and it will interpolate between this low poly geometry on this side and this part here, and interpolate the weights across the arm for the weights to transfer. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to grab the modifier stack. We're going to go to add modifier on the high poly mesh, push data transfer. I'm going to put that above the armature. We're going to make the source the low poly mesh, and we're going to turn on vertex data. All right, so what we're going to do, we're going to transfer the vertex groups from the low poly mesh to the high poly mesh, and it will interpolate the values for the high poly. We push generate data layers. So look at the moment, the high poly mesh has no vertex groups. We push generate data layers. If we go back to the data properties, you'll see it's actually added those vertex weights. Now, if we apply that modifier, and now let's hide away the low poly mesh and try to manipulate this high poly mesh, you'll see it's actually transferred the weights. Now it's not perfect, of course, because the way it's interpolated is based on a very low poly mesh. As you can see. But we can then smooth out these vertex weights across the board. So if we select everything here, select the mesh, go to weight paint mode, weights, smooth, and increase the iterations a few times, increase the expansion. You can see it's smoothing it out there. Hopefully we can get a nice clean manipulation of the hand and arm. You can see it's nice and smooth there. It's smooth out there. Let's give it a go. Looking pretty damn good. How cool is that? Now this comes in handy when other things come into play. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a moment. But let's have a look and see at the rest of this rig and see what we got in terms of manipulation. Not bad at all. So a nice, quick and easy way to get the weights of your high poly mesh nice and clean for animation by using a lower poly geometry. Obviously, you can always go through and clean this up, but that's how you go about it. So here's the advantages of using a lower poly mesh again. Now, if for instance, I wasn't a fan of a certain part of that weight transfer, what I can do is rather than go in and weight paint the high poly, what I would do is still weight paint the low poly. And let's just grab these two, isolate that. And just remove the weights where we need to. So for instance here, I'm just going to remove those weights from this area because it wasn't manipulating it was manipulating too much of the palm near the index finger. I can just go through and erase the parts I didn't like. Instead of having to erase, maybe hundreds of vertices, I'm only erasing 1 or 2 or 3 in this case. I can smooth that out again on the single joint. So just go to weights, smooth. In this case, I'm just going to make it smooth out. Oops, too much. Weights, smooth. Let's bring it down to just 1 iteration. Just enough to, soften that up a little bit. Change the factor. There we go. And then let's do a fresh transfer, and then it will work just as well. The other cool thing about this method is that if you want to make it a softer transition between, the higher values of these two spans here. So say you had a span of 1, 1, and 0.5, you can move these two spans further up the arm, and then it will gradiate between the two even better. But let's go ahead and transfer that across again. Data transfer. Do the same thing. Vertex data, vertex groups, generate data, apply it based off of that geometry, apply it. Let's go back into the weight paints of this particular high poly mesh and smooth it out again. So go to weights, smooth, increase that. There we go. Manipulating pretty good. Let's hide away that low poly mesh. See how the thumb's behaving. Yeah, that looks way better. So we're getting we have a lot more control over how we can manipulate those weights without too much in terms of, I guess you can say, workload. You're reducing your workload by using the low poly mesh as your basis for your weights. So there we go there. Super cool. So how does this become useful in a broader context? So Imagine that, for instance, you wanted to have a ring on a character, and or you want to have some sort of attachments on the forearm or on the bicep. But when you try to automatically weight it, it doesn't quite fit the mesh, doesn't follow with the mesh. So as an example, I'm going to add some attachments to this arm, here. And then we're going to see how the automatic weights behave versus the weights that we've done manually. All right, so here's an example. So we have, I now have added some extra stuff to this model. So for instance, I've got a wristband, a ring, some crap on the arm, and a sleeve. And the sleeve comes in 2 parts. So what happens now if we just automatically weight these objects? Now bear in mind that these objects here don't have any proximity to other parts of the mesh. So you're pretty much going to have just the forearm and maybe some of the wrist influence that object there. Maybe it's a bit different over here. With these objects, it all depends on the proximity. So let's go ahead and automatically weight these objects and see how it behaves in conjunction with the high poly hand. All right, so let's go ahead and manipulate this thing now. And it's looking pretty good, but we're getting some issues over here, for instance. So this band of geometry has inherited different weights than the rest of the shirt. This ring here is slipping across the meshes as well. And I'm sure that if we try to maybe manipulate the hand, yeah, we're getting some issues there as well. And you know, that hand could be tighter even on the high poly mesh anyway. So we're getting a bit too much noodly arms there going on. And you can see that the mesh here is also being influenced by the bloody hand. That's interesting as well. So we're getting some interesting issues that we need to fix up with regards to getting the weights across everything to be the same. Let's have a quick look at the hand, at the finger as well, just to make sure how this is manipulating. Luckily, the ring finger is being okay. I think it's still, yeah, it's fine. That one's okay, but the rest is having some issues. So let's go ahead and swip back to our low poly mesh. And at first, I'm not going to smooth this out again, but I am going to fix up the weights here, just on this arm here for now. Let's jump back into those 2 joints there. And we're going to weight paint the wrist to have a bit more influence from the forearm. So I'm just actually going to give that a value of 1 to keep that nice and sharp. So this is a nice thing about this method of using a low poly mesh, is that, again, I'm not working through every single piece of geometry. I'm working through one, and it becomes a lot easier to deal with long term. All right, so just painting in that value on that forearm a bit more stronger. There we go, that should be fine. Keeping it nice and clean. I could smooth this out a little bit here between the bicep and the forearm. So I could, for instance, grab the blur brush and blur that out a little bit, just a little bit. And you can double check what it's blurring between by going to the edit mode, select the vert, and just see what's being influenced here. So the wrist is still taking on some influence, so I want to get rid of that completely. So again, let's just quickly go back and get rid of that blurring. I want to double check, make sure it's absolutely gone. And you can see here the forearm is taking on most of that manipulation. I can deal with just a little bit there. All right, cool. So in that case, let's go through this again. I'm going to select the object, the forearm here first. Data transfer to the low poly. do the same thing. Vertex data, vertex groups, generate data layers. There we go. And before I apply this, I'm going to transfer this modifier to the other parts as well. So what I'm going to do is you got to make sure that you need to have this plugin turned on for this to work. So go to copy attributes menu, turn that on. And when you go control, now select everything else. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'll do that manually later. Select the arm last that has the data transfer, push Control C, and then go to copy, select modifiers. Push data transfer, push OK, and it will transfer that, that modifier to the other objects with the same settings. All you gotta do is generate those data layers for those individual pieces. So generating those data layers. Here we go. I've already got a armature set up for those, so don't have to worry about that. But there we have it there. Same thing here. I'm just going to make a manual data transfer for this one. Selecting the low poly, vertex data, vertex groups, generate data layers. And now, once we've done that, we can apply them all. So I'm going to apply each of these different data transfer modifiers. Like so. And now, even though it's still a bit crooked at the moment, these properties should inherit fairly easily now. They'll all manipulate on the same level because it's transferring the same weight data. See how it's all manipulating the same way there? Now the only thing we need to do is smooth out these groups all with the same value. So let's hide away that low poly mesh again. I'm going to jump into the high poly hand to start off with, just so I can see how this is working. And you can always, this is what you should do as well, by the way, when you're testing your weights, is animate the rig. So I'm going to animate the rig like so. So you don't have to constantly be manipulating the hand. So you can see how it's all manipulating all that sort of shit. All right, so there we go. You can see it's all doing its thing, and I have this other window open just to show you how it's all looking at the moment. It's a bit sketchy because of the we have to smooth out those weights. But now, if we select our objects like so, save the file, go to weight paint, and hopefully this will work, where we just go to weights, smooth, and we're going to smooth it all with the same value. Let's see if that worked. Not sure if it worked across the entire board. Probably not. Might have to do it on an individual basis. Let's go into weight paint mode. Make sure you have the selected joints. Weight paint. And then we're going to go to weights, smooth, same value for all of these different objects. All right, I think I've done them all. So now, if I go ahead and try to manipulate this, you'll see that the weights have smoothed across evenly across all those different pieces of geometry. And we're getting a much more consistent deformation across the board. So check that out. I don't know if I actually did the arm. I think I forgot to do the arm. Yeah, I forgot to do the arm. Let's just do that. Smooth it. There we go. Sweet. But yeah, you can see here that now we have a perfectly weighted costume as well. So by using that low poly transfer and then smoothing out those weights evenly across everything, we're getting a much more consistent result with our deformations. And this is why this is one of the most useful methods if you're working with high poly. Now, I must say that this method here of using a ultra low poly mesh to transfer weights can still apply to these medium poly meshes as well. So don't be afraid to try it out with something like this if you plan on manually weight painting. Now, there's one more feature that I want to show you. One more thing that I think would be useful if you're too lazy to do even this, which, you know, to be honest, I'm the same way. I fucking hate weight painting. So I want to show you how you can get about doing this level of deformation, you know, having everything follow through with separate meshes all at once without needing to necessarily weight paint if you're in a rush. And this requires a plugin. It's a paid plugin, but it's damn awesome. All right, and that plugin is known as, or called, the Voxel Heat Diffuse Skinning plugin, and it's $30. So if you have $30 to spare, it can be an absolute lifesaver. And I guarantee it, in my experience so far using it, it's so useful at times. It's really, really useful, especially if you have really different kinds of geometry having to work together for a rig or for animation. So you can see here, you know, check out the videos, check out the plugins, check out the way it works, but it's super, super useful. And yeah, another example here, you can see like straps and stuff really come in handy. It really comes in handy when you're having to like put straps and attachments and even like the dress to work together. So let's go ahead and check that out. So I've got a duplicate of that arm now. Everything is unrigged except for the hand. And there is a reason why. There's a reason why. I'm going to save this just to show you why, because it does have limitations. This plugin does have limitations, and it's namely to do with the proximity of limbs. So if your like fingers are too close together with the model, the voxelization can get the different appendages confused and merge them as one under a single rig, and you get weird deformations. But for like these larger aspects, super, super useful. So we don't need the low poly rig for this one. We just need to have the geometry as it is. The only thing I'm going to do, I'm going to keep the geometry here rigged up and weighted. So I want to keep the hands nice and consistent. I don't want them to be manipulated. So what I'm going to do is you can actually lock off vertex groups so they aren't manipulated again in the future. So I'm going to lock off the all the fingers basically. So everything from the pinky down, I'm going to lock those off so they can't be edited. Leaving the wrist, forearm, and bicep available for manipulation. And for the rest, doesn't matter. I don't care about these vertex groups. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to delete all of these vertex groups just to show you that it will work, how it works. Delete all these groups. And hopefully my demo will work. I'm going to keep this one okay. I'll leave that one as is. The main issues is with clothing and appendages and stuff like that, accessories on your mesh. This is where the voxel heat diffuse really comes in handy. So what it does, it basically creates a cage it automatically creates a cage for you using voxels. So it doesn't require you to make your own low poly cage. It kind of makes its own out of a voxelization method or something in the background. So what we're going to do is select all our objects that we want to weight paint to this rig. We're going to select the rig now, and now you'll see a little tab called Mesh Online. And what we're going to do is push Voxel Heat Diffuse Skinning. There we go. And now you will see it does it automatically for us. And in some cases, it does a better job because of the transfer of the voxelization. All automatic, and doesn't require you to do any weight painting. Now, you'll see here, the only difference is that the fingers and stuff still have the exact same manipulation as these ones because I locked off the fingers. So sometimes it's a combination of different methods that will help you get exactly what you want out of your model or out of your rigging. So I definitely recommend you checking out that plugin, the Voxel Diffuse Skinning. If you can't afford that, then you have your cage mesh method. And if you don't want to do that, try and work with a lower poly model when weight painting. So yeah, that's my methods. That's my go-to methods out of the lot of, there's tons of different other methods to go with, like mesh deforms and all sort of stuff, modifiers, that sort of thing. But those are my my key go-to methods when it comes to weight painting. That being said, I try to avoid weight painting at all costs, and I try and make my mesh as clean as possible so that when I do automatically skin it, I get a very consistent result. So that's another thing to be aware of. But overall, that's it for when it comes to this tutorial and the final tutorial. I'll wrap this up with a bit of a time lapse of me rigging up Ragnar, or at least weight painting Ragnar, to get it up to scratch. And hopefully these methods that I've shown you will help you get better weight painting results faster than just dicking around trying to smooth things out, trying to blur things. It's just a pain. Try and work with absolutes, then smooth. Absolutes, then smooth. And another thing to be aware of is try and keep the geometry that is low poly, if you're going to use a cage, in line with the joint structure of your joints. So if you have a joint here, joint here, joint here, you'll notice that the cage, if I bring it back, the cage, the cage sort of lines up with the joint structure. So you want to be able to weight paint the least amount of things possible. So wherever there's points of articulation, that's where you would have a span for that low poly cage. Wherever there's points of articulation, okay? So that being the points here, 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 and of course the fingers. So keep that in mind when you're doing your low poly cage. But that's it for this one. Good luck with the weight painting. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments. Happy to answer anything I can think of. If I can answer it, I will. Otherwise, I'll point you in the right direction to some other methods. All right, apart from that, all I'm going to say is good luck, have fun, and I'll catch you later. Cheers.